Hello everyone and welcome to lecture 48. So, in our previous lecture we have looked at the short run supply curve of a perfectly competitive firm, and we identified that the short run supply curve is the upward sloping part of the marginal cost curve above the minimum AVC. Recall, the minimum AVC is the shutdown price. For prices below the minimum AVC, the optimal choice of the firm is to not produce at all. For prices above the minimum AVC, the firm will produce, but whether it's and that output choice is going to be based on comparing the price with the marginal cost. Whether its profit is going to be positive or not will depend on how does the price compare with the minimum average cost, right. So, we did that discussion in our last class, and we also saw a particular example. I hope you have been able to identify and confirm that the price P star was indeed greater than the minimum average cost when the cost curve of the firm was C equals 0.1 plus 150 Q square. I would also suggest you repeat this entire example by considering a new demand curve. Keep everything else the same, the cost function to be the same, 300 firms, but suppose now the demand curve Q, the new demand curve Q prime is, let us say, 80 minus P, right. If you had this as the new demand curve, find out what your new equilibrium price is going to be, identify the new equilibrium quantity traded, and also identify what is the quantity Q star of each firm. Okay. Now, let us move on, and today I am going to talk about the long run market supply. Long run market supply. Until now, the number of firms that were in the market were fixed. In our previous example, we had n equal to 300 firms. So, even if these firms were making a loss, these firms could not leave the industry, or even if the firms were making positive profit, a new firm, a 301st firm, could not have entered the industry, right. The reason why we did not allow the firms to exit the industry or the firms to enter the industry was because we were looking at a short run decision of the firm, and in the short run capital is fixed. So, think of it is difficult for a firm to build a new plant overnight and enter the industry. Okay. So, let us first identify and state the key differences between the two, the short run and the long run cases. So, the key difference between the short run and the long run is that capital is changeable, right, is that capital investments creates fixed costs that can change, Okay. So, the key difference is that in the long run, so you can not only change the amount of labor, you can also change the amount of capital, right. So, this implies that new firms can enter the industry and existing firms can exit the industry, right. So, in the long run we are allowing the number of firms to be changeable. In fact, we will identify or we will determine from the model what the optimal number of firms is. So, in short, we are allowing firms to enter the industry, and we are also allowing the incumbents or the existing firms to leave the industry if they wish. Now, let us ask what will drive this decision, right. So, when will a new firm enter the industry and when will existing firms exit the industry? Well, that decision is going to be based on profit, right. So, if there are 300 firms in the industry which are making positive profit, a 301st firm which is outside this industry may want to enter this industry, right. So, it is looking at various opportunities where it can deploy its capital, and it sees that here is an industry where there are 300 firms which are earning profit, and by profit here I mean economic profit. Recall, economic profit for us is total revenue minus all costs, because cost for us is the opportunity cost. It includes all possible, is the sum of the explicit and the implicit costs. So, profit will determine the entry or exit decision. And let me be more precise, it is the economic profit which is going to determine whether a firm will enter the industry or whether a firm will exit the industry. In particular, zero economic profit, right, zero economic profit, which is economic profit is, notice, total revenue minus all the cost, which is nothing but the opportunity cost, right. So, total revenue minus total cost for us is total revenue minus the opportunity cost. Zero economic profit is enough to satisfy a business owner, right. So, that essentially says that the returns that you are going to get from this industry is exactly identical to what you would have obtained had you deployed your capital elsewhere, right. So, they are able to earn in the industry what they would have earned elsewhere or in any other industry. Right. So, by reallocating your capital, by leaving this industry and let us say moving your capital to some other industry, you are not going to be doing any better, because if there was a possibility for you to do any better, you would have actually shifted the capital from your current industry and you would have moved elsewhere. Now, but zero economic profit is enough to satisfy a business owner, because notice, zero economic profit is total revenue minus the explicit costs minus the implicit cost. And notice, total revenue minus the implicit cost is your accounting profit. So, your economic profit is essentially your accounting profit minus the implicit cost. Right. So, this we have seen a little earlier when we talked about opportunity cost. So, in case you have forgotten how we had defined opportunity cost, it might be a good idea to go back and review those lectures, right. So, positive economic profit means that a firm is able to earn in this industry than what it would have earned elsewhere. Than what its competitors in other industries are earning. Which implies that this will attract firms, if you prefer, it will attract investors who are looking for an investment opportunity to enter this industry. So, essentially what I am trying to argue here is that the moment a firm is making positive economic profit, it is getting more in this industry compared to what its competitors in other industries are earning. So, you are doing better in this industry. So, that is going to attract more firms into this industry. And notice, by zero profit, we essentially mean zero economic profit, which is that I am earning what we call as normal returns. Okay. Now, let us try and visualize this. Let us try and first, before we draw the long run equilibrium and define what the long run equilibrium is, let us first understand how to graphically represent profit of a firm. Okay. So, recall, profit is your total revenue, which is P star times Q minus your total cost. Your total cost is your opportunity cost. So, keep this in mind. So, if I want to identify the profit of a firm pictorially, Q, let us say rupees per unit. So, there is going to be an average variable. In the short run, I have an average variable cost, I also have an average cost curve, but I am only going to draw the average cost curve here. There is going to be an average variable cost curve below, which I am not representing, and there is going to be a minimum AVC, which also I am not representing, right. So, all I am going to do is I am going to draw the marginal cost curve above the shutdown price. So, this is my marginal cost curve above the shutdown price, right. So, I had in mind an AVC curve, which is also a U-shaped curve. There was a minimum AVC as well. So, that is the shutdown price. For prices above the minimum AVC, the firm is going to be producing. So, now suppose I have a price which is equal to P1 here. This is the equilibrium price set by the market. This equilibrium price P1 is greater than the minimum AVC. Because it is greater than the minimum AVC, the firm will produce, and the firm will produce some positive quantity of output. The amount of output that will produce is given by Q1, right. So, what is going to be the total revenue? The total revenue for the firm is P star times Q. Well, what is, or rather in this case it is P1 times Q. So, the P star is actually P1, that is the equilibrium price, and the Q is essentially Q1. Now, that is the area of this rectangle, is not it? So, if I put some notations, let me say this is A, this is B, and Q1 and 0. So, it is the area A, B, Q1 and 0. So, this is this rectangular box. Now, I need to identify what is the C of Q1, right. So, what is C of Q1? What is the cost incurred by the firm to produce these Q1 units? But notice, by definition, it is the average cost that the firm incurs to produce each one of these Q1 units multiplied by the number of units that the firm is producing. So, in other words, if I could find out what is the average cost incurred to produce these Q1 units, well, that is going to be this number. This is the average cost of producing each one of these Q1 units. That multiplied by Q1 is going to give me this lower rectangle, right. So, let me write this as DE, right. So, that is going to be the area DE Q1 and 0, right. So, the total revenue is the bigger rectangle A, B, Q1, 0. The total cost is the smaller rectangle DE Q1, 0. So, if I subtract the total revenue from the total cost, the profit essentially is going to be this area. This is the profit, right, and this profit area is going to be greater than 0. So, this is a profit which is going to be greater than 0. Now, similarly, if I try and look at a scenario where the profit is negative, well, when will the profit be negative? The profit is going to be negative when the price is going to be lower than the minimum average cost. Let us try and draw that graph also. So, if I look at another scenario, rupees per unit, I have the average cost curve. I also have the marginal cost curve above the shutdown price. This is my minimum average cost, but let us say I am taking a price P1 which is here. It is above the minimum AVC, so the firm will produce in the short run, but let us say I have a price P2. This is the price set by the market. Now, at this price, the quantity produced by the firm is based on price equals marginal cost, which is Q2. So, the total revenue is this area A, B, Q2 and 0, right. So, the total revenue is essentially P2 times Q2, which is the area A, B, Q2 and 0. What is the total cost? Well, the total cost is the average cost of producing each one of these Q2 units, and I multiply it by the number of units that are being produced, right. So, this is the average cost of producing each of these units. So, the total cost of producing Q2 units is the average cost of producing Q2 units multiplied by Q2, which is nothing but the area of DE Q2 0. Now notice that the total cost area is going to be greater than the total revenue area. So, if I subtract the revenue from the cost, I am going to get this particular area here, and this area now is going to be negative, right. Now, because the price was lower than the minimum, average cost, it turned out that the profit was less than 0, right. Now, okay. So, let us try and now define the long run equilibrium. Let me first draw a picture and then we will define what the long run equilibrium is. So, the way we want to talk about this is that we are allowing free entry into the industry and we are allowing free exit from the industry also. So, let us say I have one firm here and I have the market scenario on the right hand side. This is one firm and this is for the market. And for convenience, I am going to allow symmetry between the firms in the sense that I am going to assume that all the firms are identical. And let us start with the scenario that there are 50 firms in the industry, right. So, suppose there are 50 identical firms in the industry. So, each of these firms is going to have, let us say, some average cost curve, right. This is AC as a function of Q. There is an AVC also, which I am not going to draw, and I am going to draw the marginal cost curve above the shutdown price. So, let us say the marginal cost curve is above the shutdown price. And suppose for a moment, and what do I know? The upward sloping part of the marginal cost curve above the shutdown price is the minimum, is the supply curve, right. So, this is the minimum AVC. So, there is an AVC curve which is a U-shaped curve which we will not draw here. So, if I wanted to draw the supply curve of the 50 firms, the market supply curve, what would I do? I would be aggregating these marginal cost curves. So, I will find out the quantity produced by each one of these 50 firms and I will scale it up by 50. So, essentially what I would get is that I would get a supply curve which is S50, right. So, I take them just as we did for the example where there were 300 firms, we identified the supply curve of each firm based on price equals marginal cost. We aggregated all of them to get the aggregate or the market supply curve. So, here my market supply curve is S50. Suppose for a moment that the demand curve is here. Let us say this is my demand curve. Now, the demand curve and the supply curve is going to tell me what the equilibrium price is. So, that equilibrium price is, let us say, P1. So, the market says that the equilibrium price is P1. That price P1 is greater than the minimum AVC. Because it is greater than the minimum AVC, each of these firms is producing. In fact, here it is even greater than the minimum average cost. The minimum average cost is here. So, at this price P1, each of these firms is producing Q1 quantity of output. 50 times Q1 is going to give me the equilibrium quantity that is going to be traded in this market, right. So, suppose there are 50 firms in the industry, the current equilibrium, right. So, the graph on the right tells us that the current equilibrium price is P1, right. Each of these firms is taking this price P1 as given, and at this price P1, these firms are going to determine what quantity they want to produce, and the quantity that they want to produce is Q1. Each firm produces Q1 units, which implies that the aggregate quantity supplied is equal to 50 times Q1, which is what I have on the graph on the right. But notice one important thing that comes out from this graph is that each of these firms, so since P1 is greater than the minimum average cost, right. So, look at this picture here. If the price is greater than the minimum average cost, I can find out what is the profit that the firm earns. Since P1 is greater than the minimum average cost, the profit of each one of these 50 firms is going to be positive. Pi 1 is going to be greater than 0 for each of these 50 firms. Well, what does then that mean? If each of these 50 firms are earning positive profit, a new firm which is having some amount of capital and is looking to enter an industry, we look at this industry and say that here I see firms making positive profit, so I want to enter this industry. So, a 51st firm will enter this industry, right. Now notice we are moving away from the short run to the long run, because now we are allowing firms to enter the industry, right. So, the new firm is going to enter the industry, and let us suppose, just for simplicity, that this new firm is identical to the existing firms. This will allow us to simply use the same average cost function and do the analysis. That is the only convenience. Now, if a new firm is entering the industry, what is going to change? Well, now instead of 50 firms, I am going to have 51 firms. So, I will be aggregating the marginal cost curve 51 times. So, I am going to get a new supply curve. So, recall, one of the factors which shifts the supply curve is entry of firms into the industry. A 51st firm has entered the industry. So, the supply curve is going to shift from S50 to, let us say, S51. When a new firm has entered the industry, the supply curve shifts to the right. When the supply curve has shifted to the right, that is going to put, given the demand curve, it is going to lower the price. The price is going to be P2, and this is the new price that all of these firms are taking as given, right. So, originally, the story was that we had 50 firms in the industry. That 50 firms gave us a supply curve S50. With the demand curve, we identified the equilibrium P1. We figured out that this price P1 was greater than the minimum average cost. So, profits were positive. Because profits were positive, a new firm entered the industry. When the new firm entered the industry, the supply curve shifted to the right. That lowered the price from P1 to P2, and at this price P2 now, notice each of these firms is going to choose its output based on price equals, the new price equals the marginal cost. The output of each of these firms has now gotten reduced. This is what is known as the business stealing effect, right. Entry of a new firm into the industry eats into the business of the existing firms. A 51st firm has entered, has taken up some amount of market share from the incumbent firms, which is the 50 firms. And as a result, the output of each of these firms has reduced. So, each one of these firms is now producing Q2 units. However, at the aggregate level, the total quantity that is traded has increased. So, while Q2 is less than Q1, 51 times Q2 is still larger than 50 times Q1. So, more firms have entered the industry, and the equilibrium quantity demanded also has increased. The equilibrium quantity supplied also has increased, right. Now, so let us just complete the chain of thought here. So, the 51st firm has entered the industry. So, P2 is now lower than P1, the price has fallen. Each firm's output is now smaller than the original output. However, 51 times Q2 is greater than 50 times Q1. We also know that P2 is greater than the minimum average cost, right. You can see from the graph that the price P2 is still greater than the minimum average cost. So, each of these 51 firms is going to be greater than 0 for each of these 51 firms, right. So, what does that mean? A 52nd firm which has some amount of capital and which is looking to enter an industry will see that the 51 firms in this industry are earning positive profit. So, a 52nd firm will now enter. if a 52nd firm enters the industry, and let us also again for simplicity assume that this 52nd firm is identical to these 51 firms, what will happen? That will again shift the marginal cost curve to the right. So, the marginal cost curve now again will move to the right, S52, that will again lower the price. So, the cycle will again repeat. So, as long as the price is greater than the minimum average cost, a 53rd firm will enter, a 54th firm will enter, we will keep on repeating this exercise. Now, where will this stop? It will stop when the supply curve, sufficient number of firms have entered such that the supply curve has been shifted to a level such that the price has come down to the minimum average cost. So, let me just identify what the minimum average cost is. So, the cycle will keep on repeating and we will have sufficient number of firms entering such that, so let us say we started with 50, the 51st firm entered, the 52nd firm entered, the 53rd, so on and so forth, till let us say I have the 75th firm entering. So, once the 75th firm has entered the industry, the supply curve has reached a level such that the price has come down to a level which is P star, and that P star is exactly at a level which is the minimum average cost, right. When the price P star is exactly equal to the minimum average cost, notice the revenue is exactly equal to the cost. So, the profit of each of these firms is 0. So, a 51st firm will enter. This process will keep continuing and will eventually stop when each firm in the industry earns 0 profit, and notice this is 0 economic profit, right. So, this condition that we have is essentially a long run equilibrium. So, this is a long run equilibrium, right. So, what we have identified here is a long run equilibrium. So, unlike a short run equilibrium where the firms were earning positive profit, the long run equilibrium, so thus in the long run equilibrium again we must have the following 3 things. The first thing is that in any equilibrium the quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. So, that is true here as well. Quantity supplied. Each firm as before produces or chooses Q star based on the price P star equals the marginal cost, and the difference compared to the short run is, so point 1 and 2 were identical to what we also saw in the short run. Quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. Each firm is choosing Q star based on price equals marginal cost. But the third point is that the number of firms N star is such that each firm earns 0 economic profit, right. So, the key part of the long run is that firms will keep on entering till each of the firms are making 0 economic profit. So, in our previous example, we started with 50 firms. Firms kept on entering the industry because the existing firms were making positive profit, and eventually it stabilized at a point where 75 firms had entered the industry, right. So, we have identified what a long run equilibrium is. What will come up next is, can we use this long run equilibrium to now identify the long run supply curve? We know that the short run supply curve is upward sloping, right. So, we have the short run supply curve here with certain number of fixed number of firms, 50 firms, 51 firms, 75 firms. Now, what can we say about the long run supply curve? This is going to be our next topic, and at this point I would urge you to review the previous lectures on perfect competition, so that you can move from the short run to the long run scenario.